Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here in Lund after the wonderful poetry evening that we had last night. I'm looking forward to a very interesting and full day. I'd like to thank Jens Schwartz for the invitation and everyone at the university who helped to make this possible. It's really a wonderful opportunity. I've been asked to introduce myself. I wasn't planning on doing that, but I guess I know myself, so I can do that at the cup. I'm Cecile Kuznitz. I teach at Bard College, which is a small liberal arts college north of New York City. I'm the author of YIVO and the Making of Modern Jewish Culture, which just came out in paperback, I'm pleased to say. And I've published on the history of Yiddish scholarship, the Jewish community of Vilna in the interwar period, and related topics. Okay. So since I have the privilege of being the first speaker today, I'm hopefully going to be setting the scene a bit for some of the later talks. And what I'd like to do today is to talk about Jewish culture in the city of Vilna, or as I'll refer to it, Vilna. And I'll be talking specifically about the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and its place in the larger context of the city of Vilna. And so I'd like to start by posing a question that was posed in 1935 by Max Weinreich, an important Yiddish scholar who was one of the leaders of YIVO in the interwar period. And in an article in 1935, Weinreich posed the question, "For was dafke in Vilna?" Why just in Vilna? And he asked why an institute like YIVO was founded in Vilna. He wrote, there are many cities that are richer than Vilna in the number of Jews, in activists, and in money. So why Vilna? So first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar, I wanted to talk a little bit about the YIVO Institute and its work and its goals. So YIVO is an acronym for Yiddish Wissenschaftliche Institut, or Yiddish Scientific Institute, and it was founded as the first center for scholarship in the Yiddish language and about the history and culture of Yiddish-speaking Jewish communities. So YIVO set out to collect materials in these fields, to conduct research, to publish its findings, and eventually also to train younger scholars. So in this sense, it served as kind of the equivalent of a national library, language academy, and university for Yiddish-speaking Jews who, of course, had no national infrastructure of their own. And YIVO was founded in 1925, and it created four research sections for philology, history, economics and statistics, and finally psychology and pedagogy. It also created a little bit later a library and an archive, and later other divisions, the most well-known of which is probably the Division for Youth Research, which sponsored a series of well-known autobiography contests for Jewish youth and adolescents in the 1930s. So to give you a little bit of a sense of YIVO's work, I'd like to briefly outline what I see as three main goals of its work. The first was to raise the prestige of the Yiddish language, which was the traditional vernacular language of European Jewry, through researching the history of the language and through creating a standardized register of the language. So as I'm sure many of you know, Jews were not alone in this kind of process. In the 19th century, many of the so-called small peoples of Europe developed national movements where they sought to document and to elevate their own vernacular traditions, folklore, vernacular languages, and so forth as a way of demonstrating their sort of unique cultural attributes, and hence their claim to the title of a national group, so that there were political implications for this kind of work. Now, when Jews adopted these ideas linking language and folk culture to nationalism, of course, as is often the case in Jewish history, it was more complicated than for other groups because Jews had two candidates for the title of national language. So the Zionist movement, to make things, to put things in broad terms, the Zionist movement envisioned Jews as a secular national group, and it sought to reconstitute the Jews in their own distinct homeland, their own distinct territorial base, with Hebrew as the national language. On the other hand, diaspora nationalists also saw Jews in secular terms as a nation, but they argued that Jews should continue to live in the diaspora as a minority, and that there they should look for ways to strengthen their own distinct national identity and national culture based in the Yiddish language. So YIVO's work in terms of language planning was seen as, can be seen in terms of these larger nationalist goals. So YIVO's work included the Terminological Commission, which sought to create standardized, to collect variants of terminology and to create certain preferred terminology. You see here one depiction of its work. And probably its most successful and far-reaching work in this area was in the creation of a unified Yiddish orthography. The second aspect of YIVO's work that I'd like to mention is probably the phrase that was used most often to describe its overarching goal, which was to serve the folk, to serve the masses of ordinary Yiddish-speaking Jews. Now, we could ask how a small academic institute could actually, relate to a kind of a broad mass of ordinary, workers and so forth. Why would they be interested in, things like standard Yiddish orthography? For YIVO, one way that they set out to do this was by conducting research on topics that actually reflected the lives of a broad swath of ordinary people, topics in social history, topics like the Jewish labor movement, which was obviously a mass movement involving many working class people. Probably the quintessential product of folk culture that was studied by many different groups in this period was ethnography, was the study of folklore, which was considered to be, the quintessential product of the folk. So YIVO famously collected all kinds of Jewish folklore, stories, songs, and proverbs, etc. Another aspect of this question of relating to the folk is sort of the other side of this. How could an institute like YIVO, which was small and always struggling for funding, how could it actually gather material that would create the basis for its research? And it did this by recruiting a network of Sammlers or collectors who, as I'll mention in a second, were concentrated in the region around Vilna, but really extended throughout the world, wherever Yiddish-speaking Jews had settled. And these Sammlers collected all kinds of material. They collected money, which was very important for the Institute's budget, but also historical documents, data, and so forth. But probably the most famous are its efforts to collect Yiddish folklore. So here's one example of a folk tale that was collected by a student in a Jewish school. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Finally, the third goal of YIVO that I'd like to mention is its effort to serve as a center for Yiddish culture. So I mean this idea of a center in several ways. First of all, just in a practical sense, there was a need to create a center for materials, a central repository for materials relating to Jewish history and culture. And this goes back to the historian and theoretician of diaspora nationalism, Simon Dubnov, and his famous call in 1891 to preserve and collect materials relating to Jewish history. And in this sense, YIVO took up Dubnov's call and saw one of its central missions to gather materials and to preserve them and to make them accessible in one central location. YIVO also served as a kind of center for people, for scholars, for students, for people with an interest in Jewish culture, who after all were, as we say, zersägt und zerspreit, were dispersed and scattered, over a very large geographic area. And so YIVO could serve as a kind of meeting place where scholars could come and find the material they needed for their work, where people with related interests could come and meet, as we're doing here, right, bringing together people from many parts of the world in a central location for the exchange of ideas. And now finally, YIVO served as a center in a symbolic sense, because after all, if diaspora nationalists envisioned Jews as a national group, but a national group in diaspora, in a widely dispersed diaspora, with no government institutions of its own, then there was a need for a kind of symbolic center for Yiddish-speaking Jews who were so widely scattered. And as an institution that was seen as the highest authority for Yiddish culture, YIVO was sometimes described as a substitute for a government. So the linguist and literary scholar Zalman Rezen, who is one of YIVO's leaders, put it this way. He called YIVO, quote, a point of connection for all the dispersed parts of our people, the international ingathering of the exiles for the international Yiddish nation. So if Yiddish-speaking Jews constituted this widespread diaspora and it wanted to have a center, where would that center be? So, of course, many people argued that the natural site of such a center would be the city of Vilna. So Vilna assumed this role for several reasons that I'll now talk about for a few minutes. First of all, it had a reputation for centuries as a center of traditional Jewish learning, rabbinic scholarship, and culture. It was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And the traditional institutions of Vilna were centered in the neighborhood of the Jewish quarter, which is the kind of triangular area in the center of the map here. And the heart of that area was the Schulhof, or the synagogue courtyard, where the great synagogue was located and many other religious institutions. And because of its centrality in the life of the Jewish community, it was also just a kind of general place of gathering for people who came not only to pray, but to use the well, to read announcements that were posted there, and so forth. And this older heart of the Jewish quarter was marked by these narrow, twisting streets, some of which were framed by arches, which became a kind of symbol of the city. And you can see here, even in recent books, many, I noticed that Jens' book doesn't have this on the cover. It has Samuel Bach illustration, which is equally appropriate. But, 9 out of 10 books about Jewish Vilna will have some version of this image, on the cover, because it's become really iconic. Excuse me. So, if the Jewish quarter and the Schulhof and these kinds of streets became a symbol of the city, of the traditional Jewish life of the city, the person who embodied this aspect of Vilna's history was the Vilner Gaon, the rabbi who became the head of the Misnagdic movement, which opposed the Hasidic movement, and so Vilna became the center of the Misnagdic tradition within Judaism that stressed rationalism as opposed to the Hasidic stress on emotion and mysticism. And so because of this Misnagdic tradition, which was more open to secular learning, the transition in Vilna from this traditional rabbinic scholarship to the era of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, was, many have argued, was smoother, that Vilna Jews were more open to incorporating Enlightenment ideas and so forth into their culture. So, for example, the famous Rome printing press printed a famous edition of the Talmud, but also later works of the Haskalah and modern Jewish literature in both Hebrew and Yiddish. And so in the modern period, when Jewish secular movements in culture and politics began, Vilna also became a center of the Zionist movement and of the Bund, the Jewish socialist movement, which was founded in 1897 in the city. Okay, so another factor that many have cited as being relevant to what made Vilna distinctive was the fact that there was relatively less assimilation on the part of Jews there than in other parts of Eastern Europe. So Vilna is located in in a kind of borderland region known in Polish as the Kresy, the eastern borderlands that are sort of on the border between Poland and Lithuania, and as Jan mentioned, the Jewish concept of Lita, of Lithuania, is much bigger than the current borders of the state of Lithuania. It includes all of the Baltics, parts of northeastern Poland, Belarusia, and even part of Ukraine, as you can see on this map that shows where the Lithuanian dialect of Yiddish was historically spoken, the part to the sort of northeast of that line, which shows you roughly the borders of the Jewish Lita, right? So this area was a borderland region, and also historically very diverse. So it was inhabited by Lithuanians, of course, Poles, Belarusians. There's a Karaite community, Muslim Tatars, So it was very diverse linguistically, ethnically, religiously, and furthermore, the population, in addition to the population being very diverse, you can see that in this chart. I don't know how much, how carefully, we don't have time to look at it. But in addition to just having this internal diversity, the ruling power changed over time. So originally, Vilnius was the historical capital of Lithuania in the Middle Ages. It was then incorporated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the ruling class was Polish. It was then under the Russian partition. And then in the interwar period, where I'll be focusing, it was known as Vilna and part of Poland. So the rulers changed over time. So between these two factors, for Jews as a minority group within the city, there was no one consistent dominant element within the population, within the non-Jewish population, and no consistent ruling power, so that there wasn't as much pressure in one direction to assimilate either linguistically or culturally as there was in many other cities in the region because of this diversity. And so furthermore, many of the activities of the Jewish community were carried out in Yiddish, so that within the Jewish community, there was a greater degree of unity, one could say, than in other parts of Eastern Europe, where, let's say in Warsaw, where on the one hand, the Hasidim were a major part of the community, and also there was a class of Polish-speaking, culturally assimilated Jews, and these groups were both much smaller in Vilna than, say, in Warsaw, so that Yiddish was used by a greater segment of the Jewish population of all classes. So whereas in Warsaw, let's say, the use of Yiddish would be associated with, let's say, poor Jews, middle class and upper class Jews would tend, after a certain point in time, to speak Polish. In Vilna, Jews of various social classes and also various political orientations continued to use Yiddish primarily, so that it was less associated with particular political directions or classes, and rather as a point of unity within the Jewish community. And this became even more true in the wake of the First World War, when with the promulgation of the minority treaties, which recognized the principle of rights for national minority groups. And Zalman Rezen, for example, argued that Jews' best chance of being recognized as a national minority was to unite behind Yiddish and present Yiddish as their national language, and that so that it was actually seen as a political tool to help win recognition and rights for Jews. So all of these factors together led to a flourishing of Yiddish culture in the city by the interwar period, which has become, very well known. So, of course, in the realm of literature, we have the literary movement Jung Vilna. This is a plaque on a contemporary building in the city of Vilnius, showing a location where the literary group met, mentioning, of course, Sutzkever. Vilna was also famous for its theater, its press, and in particular for the Yiddish secular school movement, which established schools from the youngest ages up through high school and teacher training seminaries. And in this sense, YIVO was envisioned as the highest level of this network of educational institutions, as I mentioned, the equivalent of a Yiddish university. And the Yiddish schools in Vilna, for example, enrolled more students than in Warsaw, even though the Jewish community of Warsaw was 5 times larger. And it was also, the schools were also known for the quality of their teaching. And we see here just a poster depicting the graduating class of the Real Gymnasia, the academic high school in Vilna in 1930. And among the teachers here, I don't know if I have a pointer here, but you might recognize the Yiddish writer Moshe Kolbach, who is a very well-known writer who taught at the Real Gymnasia and was a beloved teacher there during his time there. So to come back to YIVO, so for all of these reasons that I've just outlined, many people argued in retrospect that YIVO could only establish itself in Vilna, right? That it was a natural home for an institute that was seen as the highest institution of Yiddish culture. But in fact, the idea of creating such an institution was first formulated among a group of Polish-Jewish scholars and intellectuals in St. Petersburg at the time of the Russian Revolution. And then many of this group, in the wake of the Russian Civil War and so forth, fled after the Bolshevik Revolution. Many fled to Kiev for a short time, and then a few years later to Berlin. And it was in Berlin in 1924 that Nachum Stiff composed the first detailed plan for what would become YIVO, a memorandum entitled Wegen a Jiddischen Akademischen Institut, or About a Yiddish Academic Institute. So in his memorandum, Stiff argued that YIVO's home must be what he called, quote, a great European center, like Berlin, where he was then living, or possibly Vienna. But as he's tried to rally support for his plan, he sent out copies of his memorandum to various contacts in New York, in Berlin, in various places where there were substantial Yiddish-speaking communities. But the only place that really responded enthusiastically to his plan was in Vilna, where the scholars Max Weinreich and Zalman Rezen took up his plan and immediately organized a meeting of primarily of activists involved in the Yiddish secular schools. And they approved his plan and voted to support it. But they also agreed that the center should be in Berlin. And they kind of stuck to this idea over the next 2 years, even though it became pretty obvious pretty quickly, really by the spring of 1926, that the strongest base of support for YIVO's work was in the city of Vilna, the region around Vilna, and in general this area of Litte. So the question is, why, if everyone agreed in retrospect that Vilna was the natural home of the Institute, and it became quickly that that was where the greatest support was, why did these leaders and activists resist for so long, for over 2 years, the idea of making Vilna their headquarters? So part of this has to do, I think, with the question of finances. That if Nachum Stiff originally turned to Jewish leaders in New York and in Berlin, it was because he hoped that they would be able to provide funding for such an institute. And if they were reluctant to turn to Vilna, it was because even though they were very excited by the warm, enthusiastic reception they got, they were all too aware of the poverty of interwar Poland in general, and the specific challenges that they would face for this ambitious new enterprise in Yiddish culture, particularly because they were already, the people who supported YIVO were already heavily involved in supporting the Yiddish school network. So as they put it, the Yiddish scholarship looked to the pockets of the same paupers that support the schools. And of course, originally, YIVO's founders hoped that the minority treaties would provide a mechanism whereby there would be government funding for the cultural work and educational work of national minority groups, including Yiddish-speaking Jews. But the Polish government, very rarely fulfilled those obligations, and in fact, formally abrogated the treaties. So that source of funding did not materialize. So even as YIVO realized that Vilna was the center, the de facto center of its work, it also worried about the conditions financially that it found there. So the YIVO leaders wrote, quote, "In Poland, there is simply a hunger among the Jewish masses. Of course, in such a situation, it is out of the question in Vilna that we could get some means for the Institute." So clearly one factor of Jewish cultural life in the interwar period was this constant struggle in financial terms, but at the same time, the other side of the coin was that this cultural work did go on despite these obstacles. So this kind of paradox was recognized at the time as the Yiddish writer Daniel Charney entitled an article about Jewish cultural life in Vilna in the 1930s. So he's playing on the rabbinic saying, "Ein kemach, ein Torah." If there's no bread, there's no learning. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So Charney entitled an article, his article about Vilna, "Ein kemach, yesh Torah." There's no bread, but there's still learning. So in the interwar period, the traditional institutions that I've described in the center of Vilna continued, but newer institutions like YIVO established their headquarters a little bit outside of the heart, the medieval heart of the city, in the western, a little bit to the west, and you can see that kind of brown triangle with a blue dot represents where YIVO's headquarters was built, in a newer part of the city with broad streets. It was in a freestanding building set back from the street, so clearly a contrast to the congested and dilapidated Jewish quarter, and it was surrounded by greenery and plantings, which made, an impression. And here I'll just quote Lucy Davidovich, because we're going to be hearing about her in a few minutes. So when she visited the YIVO building, she later, in her memoirs, recalled it this way. She wrote, quote, "Its location, its landscape setting, its modern design, the gleaming immaculateness of the place delivered a message. YIVO was no seedy relic of the past, it belonged to the future." So on the one hand, YIVO's building was seen as the kind of crown jewel among the Jewish institutions of Vilna, but it was also seen as I've mentioned before, as a kind of symbol for Yiddish-speaking Jews worldwide. And this aspect was captured in a feature that one saw when one entered the building. On the first floor landing on the stairs, there was a map of the world labeled in Yiddish with all the locations of YIVO's support groups and branches throughout the world marked. And in the center, the largest pin indicating Vilna. So this map gave a kind of visual representation to the idea of Vilna as the capital of Yiddishland, with its center in Vilna, and with the YIVO headquarters building as the closest that Yiddish-speaking Jews came to a capital building. So the Yiddish linguist Noach Perlutsky stated at a YIVO conference in 1935, quote, "Yiddish itself is recognized as a territory, the anarchic republic with its seat in Vilna. YIVO is the scholarly academy of the territory Yiddish." So if in retrospect it seems so obvious that YIVO would make its headquarters in Vilna, why was this the case? Well, as I've already mentioned, Vilna was seen as being more open to European cultural trends, to incorporating elements from the wider non-Jewish culture. So Moshe Kulbach's class in the Real Gymnasia performed Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde in Yiddish translation. And at the same time, the modern Yiddish scholarship at YIVO was seen as a continuation of the traditional learning that took place in the Kloisen, in the prayer rooms, and in the Great Synagogue. So the literary critic, yes, thank you, okay. The literary critic Shmuel Niger described YIVO as a modern Shas, a modern Talmud. And he said that at YIVO, students followed debates among Yiddish linguists the way students in the yeshiva study debates between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. So he said the subject matter is different, but it's the same love of learning, it's the same Litvak tradition. And so Max Weinreich, the leader of YIVO, argued in 1935 that YIVO could only find its home in a city like Vilna because, like the city itself, YIVO was an institution that sought to preserve the Jewish past at the same time that it was building the Jewish future. And he wrote that in Vilna, there is also combined Jewish tradition and the Jewish present. Only from the two elements together can one build a Jewish cultural future. So now just to sum up in a few sentences, okay, so by the interwar period, Vilna had assumed an almost mythological status among East European Jewish communities. As this one speaker in 1929 put it at a YIVO conference, quote, "For us, Vilna is not simply a city, it is an idea." And I've outlined, I think, several of the aspects of this idea of Vilna, its distinctive intellectual tradition, the relatively low levels of assimilation, and so forth, which allowed for this flowering of Yiddish culture by the interwar period. So in Vilna, YIVO became a tangible symbol for this idea of the Yiddish nation, of Yiddish-speaking Jews as a widespread diaspora that lacked the trappings of the state. And in this sense, it found its rightful home in the city that was known both as the Jerusalem of Lithuania and the capital of Yiddishland. And there, it promoted a vision of Jewish culture that was both rooted in tradition, but on the cutting edge of European trends that encompassed both the elite and the masses, and I think in this way presented a model of how Jews could be at the same time deeply rooted in Jewish culture and deeply European and part of the modern world. Thank you very much.